One second, and here we go. All right, so we're going to jump into the session now that I've done the introductions. Guys, last time what we discussed was the fact that there was a three-pronged approach on how we do best practices and how the studio mentality works when it comes to making decisions in taking a project anywhere internationally. The first thing starts off with, of course, Jay. Jay being a person who goes and builds relationships with governments. He goes in there and tries to find out, you know, where in the world can a production go to and build those relationships with entities to find out what level of certainty they can give when it comes to the risk that with a lot of the capital that the studio brings, what kind of risk assessment there is done. So he does his preliminary work and try to find out and build relationships there. And then Brian goes in and determines and looks at the incentives and the tax policies that are provided to filmmakers and the entertainment industry to see whether or not that's of any interest that they can be expanded upon. And then, of course, they get on a call with John, and John has a project. John has several different projects with several different countries that he'd like to consider based on the location and based on the script and the story and what necessitates, you know, where to go to do this production. Now that we've kind of given you a ballpark of this, what we discussed before was the three legs of the stool of what Brian was talking about. The direct investment as a studio, the actual spending that goes into that destination, calibrated in such a way that that destination, as part of their incentive, is going to be the catalyst for the studio putting the right framework for their creative decisions for the project, and what kind of direct benefit it has to the public crews, to the public, including the crews that work on the shows. John's point, of course, last time was what kind of familiarity do we have? You know, when we've gone into a country and have noticed what kind of projects other people have done that can make us feel comfortable by going into that country. Who's been there in that territory before? Who has accessed those incentives before? Who has hired those crews before? Who has shot in those locations? Obviously, somebody who's gone in there and done the homework before is helpful, because the studio can look at things in a broader perspective to see whether or not it's worth their time and effort in going into it in a much more deeper dive. So the early experiences of going into those territories that haven't been fully discovered are where the due diligence aspect of this comes into play. But so it's important to know, as what Brian was saying last time in our discussion, how deep is your crew? What are the locations that meet the script requirements? And Brian's role in the studio decision-making process is really to look at the incentives, and not just look at what the percentage of those incentives are, but most importantly, what are the eligible expenses what are the costs that actually qualify? So between the incentive percentage and the eligible expenses that you can get, that's where the meat and potatoes are. That's the effective incentive rate that they look at. These are the things that were discussed last time. I'm just trying to bring you up to date before we do a deep dive into a more in-depth discussion. So, and how much of that studio budget will be offset in that territory? That's the most important thing, is that effective incentive rate. Guys, if you want to jump in, and if I'm missing something, please go ahead and jump in and do so. But I'm about to get into the discussion by saying that the governments are going to act as studio partners when you go into these territories. So that's the value that they bring, is how much can I put onto the screen and that give me the best chance of success with the support of government. And so obviously, you know, with major motion pictures or series or high-ended scripts, you know, the economic impact becomes incredibly important because it bleeds over to tourism, you know, hotel industry, you know, things down to carpenters, laborers, whatever. And as Jay had pointed out last time, 4 in 10 people, for example, who vacation in the UK, as an example of a country, they do because they saw it on television. And John wrapped it up by saying that, you know, the skill sets that local technicians have on a professional level are very, very important, because once we want to convert those skills from, for example, if you're a caterer, from a regular caterer to a movie caterer, or a welding shop person to a special effects shop person, or for example, if you're doing 3D printing from 3D printing to prop making. These are all important. These skills are important when you're trying to develop an industry that otherwise would not be able to proliferate. So as a result of this, guys, I'm about to jump in and ask John the first big question, because this is where we are going to have the meat and potatoes of this discussion. Now that we've talked about all this, how do we build these relationships? John, I'm going to ask you the first question, and then Jay, you're going to follow up, and then Brian, you're going to tell us, how does a person, an individual from let's go through it. You're a government entity, how do you build a relationship with the studio? If you're a screenwriter, how do you build up a relationship with the studio? If you are a producer, how do you build a relationship with the studio? Guys, take it away.
Well, it's all different from my perspective. You know, the relationship for me as a production exec to a potential production center is initially it's really just research on my part. What in the world might work for this location, for this story, and so that the initial point of that relationship is probably some sort of web portal or someplace I can Google search and say, okay, I'm looking for something in Ukraine. What's there? And then from there, I'd reach out to the government, to Brian probably, but through the Film Commission or something of that sort, and start my initial contact there. And then if we have zero experience in the country or don't have producers we've worked with before that have done work in that country, the next step is to get some sort of tour of what's available there. You know, whether it's stages, infrastructure, crews, locations, just to feel the boots on the ground experience of being there. And typically that's a FAM tour, and Jay and Brian can talk more about that. And a FAM tour is basically a familiarity type of thing, so you can get used to and get to know people. That's, that relationship starts well in advance of, or hopefully it starts well in advance of a project coming, because then you have more time to develop that relationship. 18 months, 2 years, sometimes more, depending on it. But it takes time to get confident that you can risk $100 million in a foreign space. So that's the first step. And in that process, obviously the government entity would introduce me to local folks, whether it's filmmakers that are working locally in the country, or stages that are being built, or people that are interested in being in filmmaking, whatever it is. That would be that sort of, and then it's an ongoing dialogue from there. That's the way I would look at it. Jay, Brian, what thoughts?
Sure. Kayvan, first of all, great to be with you, and of course, John and Brian. We're delighted to return on this panel. Picking up from where John left off, again, relationships for really all three of us are critical. On the governmental side, I usually come into it one of two ways. Either a country will reach out and express an interest in attracting Hollywood productions. And so we'll have to sort of do an initial survey, as John has already talked about. What's the lay of the land? Have they had many other productions in the past? If so, what size? Do they have an existing incentive program? If so, what are the details? How competitive are they to others in their region or elsewhere? And that's sort of an initial question. Other times we'll get a call from Brian, for example, or another colleague who expresses an interest in a certain look or a certain country or region because of script specifications and the storytelling that they'd like to engage in. And at that point, we'll sort of catalog the countries that could possibly fit that description and the kinds of experiences that we've had. And all the more so now in the age of COVID, where I think so many countries are looking at this industry as a path forward economically, as a way to jumpstart their economies, as a way to create jobs, perhaps gain some traction in travel and tourism again once things open up. We're finding a tremendous amount of interest on behalf of the countries, a certain amount of flexibility to try and make whatever existing incentives they already have on the books more attractive, whether it's additional percentages of return, rebate on spend in a particular country, or increasing the eligible spend, or some way of differentiating from what perhaps other countries are doing right now and attracting some return to production. But maintaining those relationships, especially at the governmental level, is just critical. It's critical at every stage.
One second. So when we're talking about governmental level, we're talking on a legislative level, or I just want to know what level of decision makers we're talking about, because governments can be multi-layered, and sometimes when you're going in there, Jay, I'm sure when you're trying to build these relationships, it's like a maze for you, because somebody tells you, oh, Jay, you need to meet this person, Jay, you need to meet that person. That person's the person that's going to be in charge of that piece of legislation that's going to be helpful to you. How do you go ahead and unscramble all these things? And I know it takes time, and I know it's about relationships, but can you tell me about the process that you go to in trying to, unearth that?
Sure. And that's actually a really, really good point. And, I'll say at the outset that the simpler the process, the better off it is. The more complicated, the less willing Hollywood productions are going to be to come and sort of entangle a complicated process. And so for us, a lot of that is the legwork that we do on the ground, trying to understand, either with the help of private sector colleagues, local producers on the ground. Oftentimes we'll reach out to the American Embassy. They can be very, very helpful in pointing us in the right direction, at least to understand which minister or ministries are responsible for film and television production in a particular country. And that's really sort of the initial step.
Yeah, sometimes it's arts, sometimes it's tourism, sometimes it's some other department. So it's that's a difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah, because
sometimes it's a hybrid, which makes it more complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, because it seems to me Jay's job is so delicate, because at the end of the day, what he's looking for is somebody that's going to kind of guarantee stability at some way, security, to make sure that he's reaching the right kind of people that are going to be decision makers if something hits the fan. For trying to be as polite as possible, and because you're trying to mitigate that risk, you're trying to limit that risk so that there's no surprises. Because I know Brian's going to be talking about this, that the last thing you want is a surprise financially when you're gonna, when the production starts spending tons of money.
So the last thing I'll say before throwing it over to Brian is exactly, spot on predictability, right? And just to underscore, we don't get involved in the politics of any country. We're agnostic. We're pro film and television. We want continuity. We want predictability, certainty, stability, and we are hopeful that the decisions taken by prior governments are continued in successor governments, and that we can continue the relationships, build those relationships in a seamless fashion.
Ryan.
So Jay's last point, among the many points, it's an excellent point. Is one thing that we always have sensitivity to is that our investments, we might have a particular project, but we look at relationships for the long term. John has talked about this in our first panel discussion. He touched on it again. The idea here is that we've been at this for a long time, and we'd like to develop relationships for the long term. And there's always a challenge because governments turn over, U.S., North America, and everywhere else. And so what is important for us as an industry, so this is really this is an observation, not just for the U.S. studios and foreign studios and the potential direct investors in Ukraine, but it's also for the local production community. The point is, what is the benefit of the bargain? Like, what is the value of this relationship that makes sure that when there is a turnover in government in any territory, the successor government understands how important this relationship is. One way to do that, of course, is by us as foreign direct investors to continue to look at Ukraine as an opportunity and invest there. So how do we do that? I want to come back now to John's earlier comment. So we talked about this in our first panel, and very sensitive to the idea of trotting the same ground, but one very specific example. There were changes to the the Ukraine incentive regime in 2019. Normally what would happen in any significant changes is that the government would take that opportunity to meet with the key trade associations. So for us, for the US studios, it's the Motion Picture Association, and that represents all of the major studios: Disney, Warner Brothers, Sony, Viacom, etc., Netflix, for example. And it would be an opportunity to sort of present, this is what the industry looks like in Ukraine. This is our program. And they would invite, and what is important in this particular consideration is that it's the highest level of government that is willing to deliver this message. What actually makes it easier in a pandemic is that it's very hard to get the most senior executives of any government to travel to Los Angeles to meet. But to do a Zoom call or any sort of video call, it may present a greater opportunity to have the most senior officials in Ukraine in companionship with local producers to sort of deliver the message. We're open for business. This is where we see our relationship with your industry. This is the changes that we've made in 2019. We're rolling this out now. We're keen for your investment. Like, that is, short of a fan tour, that sort of ability for government, and this gets back to the trust and confidence that John spoke to.
Good point.
When government backstops the local production community and says, these are the people that you can have confidence in, because I have confidence in, whether it's the prime minister or the minister, like whatever senior level official, that is important, Kayvan. But I also want to, so I'll just pause there and say that's one opportunity, is to get the best, broadest exposure by going to the trade associations. And there's always going to be individual relationships. Local producers that know a John Corser or know his contemporaries, and they'll say, this is what we're doing locally. That should never change. I'm merely suggesting to you that at the highest level, like the broadest opportunity, is go to the trade associations. The Association of Film Commissioners International, the AFCI, or the MPA. The point is, there are tools that are available to the Ukraine production community and Ukraine officials that can say, this is what we have to offer. And I merely say that because that's what other governments are doing. Even
Also,
in this
if I may interject for 1 minute, because one of you brought up a very good point, which I know this is a very specific, this is very important to you guys, and that's, do they have what they say they have? And because what you don't want them to do is overpromise and underdeliver. Because at that time, once the credibility chain is broken, they're dead in the water. Especially when we talk about studios who we're bringing in enormous amount of capital. Let's talk about that.
Well, I want to say one more thing about the relationship a bit, because we talked about the government side of the relationship. The individual producer side, or the production service side, is also an important relationship to have. If the government isn't working fast enough, and you have a relationship with somebody like me or one of my colleagues, it's okay to reach out and say, hey, I've had that happen with production companies. Hey, we did this thing for HBO. Take a look at it. We'd like to do work with your studio. So through organizations like the PGA or the Producers Guild and other organizations, you can reach out to people like me, executives and or studio people, to make those contacts. And that's from a production standpoint. If you have a film or a show that you're trying to get to a studio, that's not me. That's not me or Jay or Brian. That's the creative and the development side. And there's a whole different path of trying to get a show made. And sometimes producers confuse us as studios coming in and doing production and getting their production made as an international production. So that needs to be said and needs to be got into more because people often misunderstand that.
So Kayvan, if I could, and I realize that we've got other items on the agenda, I just want to spend an additional minute on what John just spoke about, because I think it's important to sort of really understand the relationship between the local production community and the foreign direct investors. So the US studios, UK studios, and elsewhere. One thing that I think is important is that if you're a product, and this is actually endemic to the Ukraine film incentive scheme, like so many other territories in the world, the incentive program requires us to use a local production service company. All right, they're the VAT registrant, we have a production service agreement with them. That relationship, and I think it's just so important, and I realize it could be a burden, but I want it to be perceived as an opportunity. The production service companies, line producers, UPMs, like everybody in Ukraine that is working with US studios should understand that it is not a one size fits all. The relationships are bespoke. So some of these relationships will be turnkey, which is the US studios, UK studios, any foreign production company will expect the Ukraine production service company to do everything, right? I'll give you the financial support, you make it happen. That's not always the case. There is such enormous financial pressures on us as studios, and the risks and rewards are so high that it is important for the Ukraine production service companies to understand that there are relationships that they'll need to fit within the contours of the needs of the US studios in this particular case. So I'll say to you that for a John Corser, for example, he's going to want to be more hands-on. He's going to want to know what your location agreements are. What's your contract?
Yeah, I mean, with a John Corser, it's important because with what my understanding is, for him, it comes down to figuring out this whole decision tree of costs that he had mentioned to me before. So John, can you go through that decision tree of costs, what Brian is kind of bringing up? Because at the end of the day, it's about the labor, the infrastructure, the incentives, all these things. And once they have these things, do they really actually have it? And to what capacity do they have it? And how far in advance do you have to go and try to train them if they don't have it? So can you talk about that a little bit?
I could try. The initial thing for if I have a show is to say, okay, where in the world does it want to go? And one of the very first things, aside from the creative concerns of location and those normal sort of choices that you make, is how do I maximize the amount of dollars to screen? And for a studio, it's incentive, labor costs, infrastructure costs, and so on and so forth. It's a fairly elaborate, connected thing. So if you have, your labor costs in Morocco are really low, but the incentive is low, but your labor cost in UK is really high, but your incentive is high. You have to do a math to see if if you're building a huge set, it might be cheaper, even with the lower incentive, to do it in Morocco than in the UK, even with the travel costs. So that nuance to both incentive, what qualifies, what doesn't qualify, is a thing that I go through with finance when I'm investigating a place to go. So it's not a simple we get 40%. It's not 40%. It's the net incentive is a lot lower when you compare it to another place, because the incentive to me is the incentive to go to that place, not just the incentive of dollars or percentage. There's a lot more calculations to that. So I don't know if I gave it a complete answer to that. Maybe Brian or Jay, you can jump in there. But there's the nuances are difficult to figure out, and so it takes some time. But the decision is based mostly. Well, the other decision is also, will the cast or crew go there? Is it a place that they feel comfortable going? Is it a place that has the lifestyle they're used to when they're not working? Can they bring their family? Is there something for them to do when they're not working? I mean, there's a lot of other issues too, but that's beyond the finance issue, and that's a producer studio issue with talent at that point.
And of course, I mean, Jay having gone there first, I mean, it's my understanding in your process, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jay is the first person that goes, right? And then the discussion goes to Brian, and then it comes to you, John, or at any time, you three can kind of like.
I think I've said to Jay, hey, or Brian, hey, I got this weird show. Where in the world could this be? What if we went to, I don't know, Kazakhstan, you know, and then they would go research it for me. I mean, I wouldn't do the initial research. It would be a longer, and it would have to have a lot of lead time. So.
Right, and there are often opportunities where I've gone to places, but there isn't a show that really fits location X or Y. But John or Brian will say, well, wait a minute, 8 months ago, you told us you went to country X, and they were very, excited about trying to attract Hollywood and have been working to improve their incentive or implement an incentive. Do you think they'd be right for this? And, how do you feel about, going back to John's earlier comment, while the number itself, I'm sure is very important, and John and Brian can speak more to that. I mean, a big part of this is managing the risk and understanding if country Y is offering a 50% incentive, but it's a risky place in some way, shape, or form, either financially or security wise, or as John said, the talent doesn't want to go there, or you're going to have to bring in a lot of outside crew because they don't have a sufficient experienced crew base. Then it's a problem.
Now we have another curveball, which is the pandemic, COVID. And some places, can provide, is there going to be some kind of COVID insurance assessment? And one of our questions that we got from one of our attendees is there a COVID insurance assessment that you guys have done in each territory? I mean,
there's certainly a risk assessment, but insurance is a difficult thing to find at the moment for COVID. There isn't really any backstop for closures. I don't know, Brian, if you've found any, if Canada's doing something for the close or UK. There was something Canada, I heard.
Precisely, John. So there are territories around the world that have provided financial backstops, particularly for the local production community, knowing that they have enormous risk, and their ability to restart requires them to have some sort of safety net. So there's been less support around the world for the major studios, but certainly for the indigenous production communities, there has been some funds set aside for that. But how government can support the foreign direct investors, Kayvan, on this particular point. So you're right. It is an enormous curveball. That's to put it mildly, in terms of what COVID has done for the industry. But what it has done objectively has increased the cost of doing business and increased the degree of unpredictability of producing in any territory in the world. So to the extent that government can help mitigate those risks and allow us to make the right financial decisions in favor of that particular government, that is so important. So what you see, putting aside insurance for a moment, what you see is that governments are verifying that PPE, personal protective equipment, testing, the costs associated with that are covered by the incentive because they are necessary. They are conditions precedent for us to actually film in any place in the world at this point, not just to meet our criteria, but also the government's criteria to make people feel safe, both our crew and our cast, but also the communities that we're filming in. So those things are important as we think about the incentive in Ukraine or anywhere else in the world. And the other consideration here is just transiting people in, like the process of quarantine and testing and what government expects from us to have a clear set of principles. We've had this, we've already as an industry experienced this where governments have shifting decisions on how many people can come in at any particular point and where they can come in and where they can shelter, where they can essentially quarantine. Having clarity, this just gets back to our first panel discussion. And now it relates to COVID. As much clarity as this government can provide to our industry on what the rules are for us to film in this COVID environment, so important. But to just acknowledge that the cost that we have to incur which frankly can be as much as 20 to 25% higher than we normally would have been.
Mm-hmm.
To make sure government supports us in terms of the incentive, as well as in the clear sets of principles on getting people into the country and getting them out, so important.
One of the great things that you bring up over here is the fact that, you know, being part of the studio system is such a blessing that, you know, all independent films would love to be in that situation where they don't have to worry about the money, but having to worry about the money is a big deal. And in the studio financing world, you know, the whole insurance issue becomes even more of how do I put it, a red light. Because, you know, for the studios, they don't have to worry about that. They don't have to worry about bonding any things, and they don't have to worry about the money because you're self-financing, you're self-insured. But when it comes to the independent world, when we're comparing studio financing with the regular independent financing world, there's a thing, you know, called completion bonds, which I think we're going to probably get into in the next webinar, which is too big of an issue. But I'd like to kind of dovetail this discussion into that. Because it's my understanding in the studio financing world, it's using that incentive as part of the financing versus as a part of the return on your investment. And that's the difference. So as part of that financing mechanism, there's a thing called a completion bond, which is basically an insurance policy that the producers are going to deliver the picture on time and on budget. You know, it's a risk issue. And now that you've got COVID, you've got that. Go ahead, John.
That's the thing for the financiers. Usually, my experience with completion bonds, we don't have to use them as a studio thing because I am essentially the completion bond. If somebody doesn't get the job done, I'm screwed. I get fired. So the completion bond for an independent, you know, the financiers who typically aren't familiar with filmmaking as much, or aren't, you know, filmmakers themselves, they're people with lots of money, want to guarantee that whatever these people are doing with their money is according to the plan. And the bond company manages that, and they say, you know, they guarantee through their experience that if the producers deviate, they will jump in and take over and fix it. Now, you know, the bond is a whole different entity. I mean, the financing mechanism of independent film, as opposed to direct investment like the studios do, they have to use that incentive. Part of their calculation that we don't make is how fast can you get the money back. So from the incentive program. So because they want to use that money for post. I mean, the longer they hold their financiers' money, or even a loan sometimes, is interest on the loan. So if they can pay that off faster, they're better off. So, you know, and again, the bond company ensures that they're going according to that plan. If they're delaying and they're going to have to pay more money, that increases the amount of risk for the investor. It's not my world. I'm not a financier. It's just my personal, you know, view of it. And Brian, you probably, or Jay, have more experience with that. But
my understanding from my discussions with you has always been that the only reason you have the bond is because you don't have the financing in the first place. And we don't have the financing
because you don't have 100% of the financing.
Right. So because you need to monetize your gap, and you need to get the incentives, and how you spend that money properly is going to be mission critical. Because if you're an independent production and you don't really know how to deal with the, you know, the money that's coming in and out, because you may not have the infrastructure set up like a studio does, you know, you got to be careful.
It's outside my thing, but picture this: you go to Jay comes to you for money, and you're going to give him, you know, say $5 million, and you're supposed to trust Jay to do everything right. No, you want a third party to say to manage Jay, because you don't want to have to, Kayvan. That's your bond company. That's essentially what you're paying them to do. If you're a bank, you don't know how to trust Jay, right? You just don't know the situation. So you say, yeah, I want these other people.
The company takes a percentage, what, 3 or 5% or something like that. Pardon me?
It changes.
Okay, so it takes a percentage. It takes a percentage, and just to guarantee that you're just doing your job, basically an overseer. Correct.
Simplifying the shit out of bond.
I mean, well, but because I'm trying to like set it up for the next discussion. But yes, because I'm not an expert in that area, and I'm just trying to like, bring up this information because it's important, because now that we're dealing in the era of COVID, this is an added risk. This is an added thing that, in 2018 and 2019, when Jay was going out and meeting governments, there was never like a discussion like this when it came down to government guaranteeing a stable and secure environment for the studio to come into. And now you got this thing where everywhere in the world you go, you have this issue.
And
So it's not just specific to the studios, it's also specific to independents, but independents are going to get hit the hardest because they can't afford it. And some investors are not going to give you the money unless they know, oh my God, even with this added risk, I better make sure you're doing your job right, because if not, I'm going to lose all my money. Am I right or am I wrong? Tell me.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to talk for bond companies. I should keep quiet, but like, I'll get you a bonding guy to talk to you about it.
Well, we're gonna count on that for you. But go ahead. You were saying something. Brian, did you want to say something? I think I heard you.
Well, I was just going to add. So the point that the degree of risk, Kayvan, that you were just referring to in this environment, absolutely. So many of us are doing business without a safety net, without a net at all, and that just makes it all the more difficult for content to be created, and particularly challenging for independent producers, which why governments, and John made reference to this, governments like Australia and Canada have provided, and the UK have provided supplemental funds to protect local productions, local producers, to make sure that they can actually continue to make their content. So there is a role for government to play here. I don't want to discount that. So what we're talking about on completion bonds is the private sector's interaction with each other. But there is certainly an overlay here in terms of where government can get involved to make sure that content can continue. I'm not suggesting that this is a solution for foreign direct investment. I am suggesting that is this government, as every other government evaluates, how do they protect the cultural creation of content in their particular territories? One way to do it is to make sure that there is a backstop. If a project is shut down again, and they will be shut down because of COVID. So my point about making sure that if a US studio, for example, films in Ukraine, that the cost, the incremental costs that we incur locally are actually part of the incentive base, right? The PPE and the testing. But also, if we are shut down, you have governments everywhere from Serbia to Greece to California that says this pandemic is an act of God, and if you have a shutdown, you can hold your place in line for incentives. When you're ready to restart, and hopefully you will be able to restart, your incentives will be there for you. So it's just that sort of assurances. It's like, how can government help the industry restart and continue investment in this incredibly difficult environment? And those are just some of the ways that I think government can help us, all right, and can help themselves in investment.
And let's not forget that if you're lucky enough to be one of those productions who can make it through these stormy waters, talk about, impressing John and you guys, because at the end of the day, what he was talking about, you rely on the experience of independent producers who've gone through this before,
Sure.
Correct, John? Am I, you want to jump in? I mean, at the end of the day, the groundwork that they do.
Absolutely. If we probably are not the first people to go into a area to do the production. We rely on producers that have been there before, and we call around to our friends and people we know, like, what was your experience there? So that experience of the smaller independent production influences how a studio looks at the place. Like, is it safe enough for a larger production? Can we escalate that 5-10 times? Is it, if there is one crew that can serve a $5 million film, is there enough of a crew base to serve a $100 million film or TV series, right? Those are the sorts of things that you look at. And if the incentive, I mean, there's states in the US and there's countries around the world where the incentive program is growing. It's in its nascent stage where they're saying, hey, we're going to attract the small independent film, and then if it works, we'll grow it to a larger even in Canada. I mean, Brian and I worked in a territory or a province in Canada where they had to increase it for us.
I'm going to turn it over to the Q&A session, because we can go on and on ad infinitum about so many things, but I want to address some of the questions that are coming our way. One of the questions that's come in right now is, in terms of ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, how critical is the availability of certified health and safety specialists in local production companies for bringing the project to country X, assuming the incentive program X is attractive? I think we kind of answered it, but if you guys want to give it a more precise answer.
Brian, do you want to jump in there first?
Sure. Look, I'm happy to. I think a couple of things. One is, what are the rules? What are the local rules? What is the local government what do they accept as certified testing measures? What are the steps that government expects this industry to take? And we're dealing with that now as an industry around the world. So to the extent that there are credentialed health specialists in a particular territory that the government supports, that's important for us to know. And we'd like to think that that fits into the contours of what we think as a studio is important, that is safe for us to return to production anywhere in the world. But yes, having credible local resources is important.
And
now,
go ahead.
Let
me just jump in there. Like, one of the things that is going to mess everybody up everywhere in the United States, around the world, is the testing and getting the responses back fast enough, right? So if you're inundating, the testing facilities say that, yes, we can handle, X amount per week, but then a movie comes in and we're testing 100 people a day, all of a sudden the system breaks down.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that it wouldn't, I mean, I don't know. It's one of the criteria that we're going to evaluate when we decide where to take a show, right? That, and even if you're looking at New York right now, they're shutting down spaces. The stability of the COVID plans in the different states and countries around the world, you're looking at as well. It's a criteria. It's just one of the maddening ones at this point. I don't think you would, if there is there's no country in the world really that has a horrible situation. And maybe Brian or Jay, you could talk to this in terms of managing the COVID thing that we would consider. It's more of like just another factor that we consider.
Listen, you're talking about a situation where the West Wing of the White House has more COVID cases now than about 19 countries. So it's a very serious issue. And we're told that the White House tests on a regular basis. So the kind of testing, how often, what kinds of labs are available, all of those I think are critical issues for keeping production up and running safely.
I mean, yeah, because one of the challenges also, I'm involved in a production right now, in this, with having to hire multiple people for multiple roles, just in case one person, gets COVID, and then you have to have the backup, the standby, and so on and so forth. There's
also issues if the plans conflict with our return to work plan with our unions. There's issues there that we have to work out with governments and regional areas. And that sometimes takes longer negotiations. And if we're in a timeline, we won't take the time to do that. But
well, here's another question for you. I mean, if you're in Ukraine, what COVID compliance guidelines do you follow? Because there's so many of them. Of course, Netflix has their own, version. The DGA. Pardon me.
We follow NBCUniversal.
Right. Okay. So so basically every entity or whatever comes up with theirs, and what if are there subtle differences in one over the other, and are there cost differences in following the guidelines of one over the other?
Well, it's the more Brian, you can talk to this. I'll let you go.
No, I was just going to offer the following. So our experience around the world is what John just described, Kayvan, the safety measures that NBCUniversal has instituted for our productions are going to be more stringent than any territory in the world. And in fact, they're done in collaboration with the unions and the guilds, and they have their own set of protocols. The point is, we can't afford to be wrong. Like the degree of risk here is so great that our level of care is so far beyond what government would expect, and which is really a source of frustration because I realize that every government is sort of thinking about how do they restart their economies, and it is not a one size fits all. I would, and clearly I'm biased, but our industry has gone to such extraordinary lengths, and whether it's Netflix or Disney or NBCUniversal and any of the others, and our unions and guilds, we've all gone to such extraordinary lengths to keep people safe, our cast, our crew, and the public. The risk of being wrong is so great, we can't be wrong. It will happen, however, which is why my point earlier, Kayvan, about if we have to shut down, will government be there for us with the incentive when we're ready to restart? So I'll just restate that point again. But John, that's my perspective, is that we're going to have safety protocols that are going to exceed whatever's local.
So if anybody's listening in Ukraine that it wants to know that one of the great things that you can do to set yourself apart is to make sure that you know that there is that backstop.
Yeah.
Correct? I mean, as an insurance type thing, or not? I mean, I would like to hear your opinion on that.
It's to protect both your line in you know, to make sure you don't lose your incentive if you
Right.
stop for 6-8 months or whatever, you know, or
Right.
even a few weeks, and also to support your crew so you don't lose your entire crew because you shut down for 14 days and they moved on to other jobs or whatever. You need to keep those people with you on a production. You don't want to lose it. That's the risk. And so you want to support those people. That's the biggest problem we have, is if we have to shut down, like I think didn't Jurassic World shut down? I saw it in Deadline.
So Jurassic shut down, Batman shut down, we had to shut down Chicago Fire. Like the point is, like, it happens. It's not a theoretical, it's a reality. So just being prepared for that and making sure that government is thinking about those scenarios is so important for us. And as enterprising as the Ukraine government can be about what the risks and rewards are for this industry and its relationship with Ukraine in this environment, so important.
All right, let's go ahead and wrap it up. I think I don't have any extra questions from the group. If there's anybody out there that's would like to pose a question, please go ahead and do so within the next minute, because I'm going to ask the panelists to wrap it up and give their final thoughts about what we've been discussing and the point that they want to emphasize the most for our audience out there. One for specifically addressed to independent producers in Ukraine, and the other hopefully to people that are in the legislative body or decision-making process in the country of Ukraine that are really looking to enhance and build the relationships with studios like NBCUniversal. Guys, who wants to start? John?
Well,
you knew this was coming.
Whatever. I'll go first. To me, I want to see a sustainable film community that's growing in a production center that I'm moving into. So that's expanding. There's so many places I've been that have tried to start up a film community, and they shot too high, and it's not sustainable for a job for somebody year round. So some projects are only 3 months or 2 months or a month. So one show at a time isn't enough. I need to see
a pipeline of
shows that are happening so that these people are working all the time. Otherwise, they'll go on to being a barista or some other thing, and they won't be available to me as a producer of a big show when I need them. And so if it's not a vibrant film community in and of itself, whether it's attracting foreign direct investment, a local film community, you know, doing local productions, doing regional productions, whatever, commercials, just some sort of churn of production, so that there's infrastructure there, there's crew base there, there's resources there that understand filmmaking. That's for me, it is as big as an incentive.
So I'll just pick up from where John left off. You know, John mentioned sustainability. From our perspective, Ukraine presents a really exciting opportunity, right? Not just for investment in Kyiv, but in Lviv and so many other places. You have geographic diversity, you have talented crews, and I don't want to speak for the filmmakers here on the panel, but we know that there's a desire to show different and new pictures on screens, large and small. So if we know that we have a committed partner on the government side, again, not with any one particular government, but just ongoing, and it could be, by the way, not just the central government, but I think we touched upon this a little bit, regional governments, mayors, towns, municipalities that would also like to sort of tweak whatever is provided on the federal level. If they're able to add a little topping that makes it more attractive to film in their particular locale or municipality, that's fantastic too. We know it's a great engine for building economies, for tourism, for all the things that we've touched upon before, all the more so now as folks are looking to jumpstart, hopefully very soon in a post-COVID environment. And we're eager to establish these relationships, to grow them out, and to see real sustainability over the long term.
Brian?
So I'll just tack on to what my colleagues have just described, and I'd like to just put Ukraine in context. So, and John and Jay have both made reference to this. This industry, right? So content creation, film and television production is perceived as part of the solution to economic recovery in a lot of territories around the world. And how that's happened is you've seen governments recommit their financial support to this industry, everywhere from France to increasing their visual effects post-pandemic, to Spain, to Romania, redoubling their program. The point is simply, and that's just in the EU, and that's just a few, New Zealand, Australia, Colombia in South America. The point is, it doesn't fit a particular profile. It is a recognition that around the world, this industry has something to offer. I'm not suggesting that what Ukraine needs to do is increase their incentives like Greece has done by another certain percentage points. What we're suggesting is take the tools that are available to us, make them as enterprising as possible. So a very simple example, to get from 25 to 30%, that extra 5% for Ukraine IP, think about that in the context of projects that John and his contemporaries can deliver. Think about what are the best opportunities to promote Ukraine, and that extra 5% can be the difference between spending another $50 or $100 million in the country or zero. It is so critical that we meet the financial equations that the decision makers on all of our studios have to wrestle with. So thinking about how enterprising Ukraine can be with its existing program and how flexible is really what we think is important here, because that will drive more attention and in turn drive more investment.
Excellent. I want to thank you guys so much. Every time I hang on, I think we got a one last second question that came in, and I want to make sure that I do it justice. And this is one last question that we're going to answer, even though you guys have given your concluding statements. During production, how do you communicate and split responsibilities with service company on a financial decision-making issues?
Oh.
So John, I tried to start that conversation. That's a whole panel, but do it in 30 seconds.
Yeah, John, do it quick.
Wow.
Take us out with a home run, John.
The production service company relationship with the studio is critical because we're going to pass millions and millions of dollars, between 20 to 70 million dollars on a TV show. I don't know, on a movie it might be different, but on a TV, through that entity. So our relationship has to be intertwined. The relationship between the CEOs of that entity and me and the studio, it has to be very, very close. Oftentimes, there's the requirement that the local production service company is a producer on the show, that they're producers. Our producers in the US get very nervous about having other people titled with what they think their role is, especially when it comes to awards and other sorts of things. So it's a very delicate negotiation. It's a way to monetize the show, but it's also, that's a very important relationship that has to be built, that we have to come to an agreement on early on. And Brian and I have gone through this on multiple shows about who the producer is, and we have to get those producers in with our producers and what the role they're going to play is. Most of the time, they're advisors to the show rather than critiquing scripts, say, or something of that sort.
But I mean, the common denominator, what all you're talking about, once again, this becomes a little bit repetitious, but the more we talk about it, trust, 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 trust. I mean, all these things that you're talking about, the common denominator between how you communicate these responsibilities between a service company and a financial decision, it's all how much trust do you have in your partners? And what are they going to be able to deliver? I mean, Jay spends his whole day up and down his whole day going around the world, just basically trying to find, who can I trust? Who can I put my, all this.
Well, I think that's how he should be spending his time for sure. But Kayvan, I want to get back. I want to get back to John's point, and this is what I tried to express before. Part of the burden and the opportunity for local producers in Ukraine is understanding the relationship between the foreign studios and the local producer is bespoke. There are a lot of John Corsers in the world who are going to be very much hands-on, accounting, legal, production. And then there's others who are going to say, here's what I'm spending, now figure out how to do that. And that is so important, that the Ukraine studios need to know how to be responsive to the needs of the foreign studios. And it is not made to measure. I mean, it is made to measure. It's not just one size fits all. But I will tell you that the risk and reward is why John Corser and his contemporaries will very much want to be hands-on and enrolled in every decision that is critical for those particular projects. They're not absentee parents. Very much hands-on.
Thank you.
There used to be a thing where you did a negative pickup. You give the script to a local producer, say, make this thing and send it off to us. That doesn't happen as much anymore. Not in my world.
Yep, for sure. For sure.
Guys, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Like I said, every time, I can't tell you how incredibly honored and blessed I am to have you as my colleagues and educating me every single time I do this. Everywhere I go, I'm always overwhelmed about the information that I get from you, and I'm able to pass it on to people who don't know. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much for participating in these panels and educating me and the world regarding your process. It's clear that you guys, the reason the studio has hired you is because you guys are simply kick-ass. Thank you from the bottom of my heart again. Thank you, State Agency of Ukraine and Production One Services and the rest of the gang. And with that, we're going to call this a wrap and call it a night. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you in Ukraine soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.